It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Who better to explain and analyze famed lawyer Clarence Darrow's involvement in a grisly, notorious Green Mountain murder case than former Vermont Supreme Court Chief Justice Jeff Amestoy? In his new book, Amestoy outlines the case against John Winters and how and why Clarence Darrow came to argue on his behalf before Vermont's High Court. The book, Winter's Time, A Secret Pledge, A Severed Head, and the Murder That Brought America's Most Famous Lawyer to Vermont, is available through the Vermont Historical Society's website, vermonthistory.org, and will arrive soon at your favorite local bookstore. In a moment, you'll hear why Amestoy dove into the story. First, a word from our sponsor, Red Hen Baking Company. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Let's begin. The title of the book is quite provocative. Congratulations. Winter's Time, A Secret Pledge, A Severed Head, and the Murder That Brought America's Most Famous Lawyer to Vermont. How could you not read a book that has severed head in the subhead?
And it's actually based on something that happens during the trial, so it's very much a part of the entire story. So
it wasn't just to get people to read the book?
It was not, but I thought it might interest folks. It interested me.
A little out of character for you. You're kind of known as being a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Staid, very, very low-key kind of guy. So let's see if we can set the stage here. What was the case about?
So this case is based on a 1926 murder in Windsor, Vermont, a sensational, notorious case in which the victim was a woman named Cecilia Gullivan, and she was probably the highest-ranking female executive in the state of Vermont at a time when female executives were very rare. And not only that, but she was a resident of Windsor, Vermont, which at the time was, I think, very few Vermonters, at least speaking for myself, realized the extent to which Windsor and Springfield and that area, which they called Precision Valley, yep, was the Silicon Valley of America. I mean, at the time, just as important, just as rare for a woman to be a leading figure in Precision Valley as it was in the early days of Silicon Valley to have a female leading that revolution. So right away, the fact that she was a murder victim was news, not just in Vermont, but really all over the country. And the other piece of that was that it was a brutal murder as she was killed in her home. So that began in the fall. This is in the fall of 1926. Began an immediate hunt for a suspect. Tremendous pressure on everybody involved in terms of trying to find a suspect. Governor immediately appointed a special prosecutor. Windsor, in addition to being the home of a really cutting edge industry, also had the state prison. So for the local police, and you have to remember there was no Vermont State Police back then, the local police decided that the easiest thing to do was to pick up somebody who had been in prison. And of course, in Windsor, there had been a number of folks that had been in prison in the community. And so they arrested well, they didn't arrest, actually. They seized a ex-convict named John Winters. And that's the title of the book, Winter's Time, comes from his name.
Precision Valley, my first job was in Springfield, so I'm very familiar with the machine tool industry, which interested me when I was there in the 1980s. Every Friday I would call Jones and Lamson, Fellows, and Cone Blanchard,
Cone
is
Blanchard,
the one I think you're referring to with her, and find out how many layoffs there were that week. It really kind of got decimated by foreign competition. So she was the chief operating officer?
She was treasurer, but also she was a machine tool expert in her own right. Cone, the forerunner to Cone Blanchard, he had begun with the Windsor Machine Company. Cecilia Galvin had come as his to Vermont when she was 25. Now at this point in time, she's her early 40s. She's not only the treasurer, but she's in charge of all the orders described by those who knew her as being a machine tool expert in her own right. And she's working in a setting with, of course, basically an all-male setting, machinists and tool operators, to say nothing of anyone else that worked in that industry, almost all exclusively male. And, probably at that point in time, several hundred employees working for Cone. Cone started his own company in 1960 after NAMCO, the National Association of Manufacturers, came in to take over the old Windsor Machine Company. Cone was a brilliant inventor, really, and a businessman as well. And so by the mid 1920s, the Cone Automatic Machine Company was one of the most significant companies in the world, really. I mean, they were making the machines that were being used by the automobile industry. And so he was often in Detroit working with automobile manufacturers, and she was really in charge of running the company when he was gone.
Tell me about the murder.
So the murder was occurred on November 6th, the night of November 6th, 1926, but it wasn't discovered until November 8th. In the interim, so November 6th would have been a Saturday night. Murder probably occurred, best estimate was early Sunday morning. But also that evening, the home was broken into in Windsor at the Everett's estate, actually a house right adjacent to the Everett's, the larger Everett's estate. That was the initial crime that shocked Windsor residents, because the Everetts were a very prominent family. They'd been in Windsor for probably over 150 years. William Everett had been Secretary of State, Senator. He had saved Andrew Johnson from impeachment. His son, William Maxwell Everett, then sort of carried on the tradition of the Everett family as the providers of a lot of jobs and a social circle in Windsor that was really predominant. 5 presidents had come to stay with them. So they were a very, very prominent family. And they had an invalid daughter who was now in her 30s, who was being cared for in a separate house. And in the middle of the night of November 6th, someone broke into that house, tried to attack her, and ran off. So that was a crime that by Sunday morning everybody knew about in Windsor. But the murder of Cecilia Galvin wasn't found until Monday morning, when she didn't appear for work, which she was often in the factory by 8 o'clock. Her boss, Frank Cone, who had been the last person to see her, had in fact, when he'd come back from Detroit, had gone to her house at 11 o'clock Saturday night. So he had been the last person to see her Saturday night. He had gone to the house twice on Sunday and said he hadn't seen her. But on Monday he went looking for her and found her in her house on a sleeping porch. And he went to get a doctor. They brought the police and then discovered a badly mutilated body.
I was going to say, it sounded like it was a pretty grisly scene.
It was the doctor who was her friend and had treated her, and his testimony at court was he talked about lifting up the sheet. She was on her sleeping porch, and they said, "Did you then put it back?" And he said, "No, I was so horrified I dropped the whole thing." So, not a grisly scene, and again, one that fed the sensationalism of the story, because there was police they didn't have a suspect, they didn't have a murder weapon, There was no motive. All this pressure to do something about it, and the fear in Windsor that there was somebody on the loose. So all that combined made for a sensational story.
And as you have talked about, at the time, there were a lot of, people will talk about today's media being very sensational, but it was even more so back then.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a really good point, because and really I hope that one of the things that readers would draw from the book is the context of the Roaring '20s in Vermont, which wasn't any different. And it was rural Vermont, it was a rural setting, but the Roaring '20s were the Roaring '20s. And one of a couple of things to remember. One, Calvin Coolidge was president. So, Vermont was at the center of things, beyond having the most significant industry in the United States, in Windsor and Springfield, Precision Valley. So it wasn't as if we were an outlier. And secondly, in the Roaring '20s, you're right, murder was the appetite. It really mirrors what we're seeing now, I think. There's this tremendous interest now in murders. If you do podcasts, there's probably more murder podcasts than on any other issue. Certainly that on foreign policy, for example.
Right. This is my first murder podcast, just for the record.
Yeah, so this is my first murder. It's my first murder book too. So, and it's not a book. It's a book in which the murder is a lens into Roaring '20s Vermont, and the other piece of that is beyond the appetite for murder, which was certainly, Vermont wasn't isolated from that. Vermonters were just as interested in murders as anything else. And if you look at which I spent a fair amount of time doing, not only was there great press coverage, of course, as you'd expect of this case in Vermont and elsewhere, but the front pages of Vermont papers, there were ordinarily 3 or 4 murder stories on front pages. That and aircraft crashes, probably.
Wow.
Because there's all this interest in the newfound flight and all the rest. And the murders they covered were all over the country, really all over the world. And the Hearst press, everyone was racing. It became clear that the appetite for murder was almost insatiable. And so again, it's one of the reasons that this case received an extraordinary amount of publicity, and certainly it was a context in which it reflected the culture of the 1920s. And the other piece of that, and it's equally significant to the story, is the 1920s. Again, reflecting probably current culture as well. The interest in celebrities was really extraordinary. Again, you had, by the 1920s now, you had a mass media, radio as a central, that was new in terms of its extension. And of course, newspaper coverage was with the Telegraph. All that was an extraordinary change in terms of how much publicity one could get in the 1920s that became a staple, again, of American culture. And certainly Clarence Darrow, who appears in the second half of this book, very importantly, was an extraordinarily, not only was the greatest defense lawyer in the United States, he was an enormous celebrity. He was as well known as Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh and Charles Chaplin. Anything he did was news. He was outspoken against capital punishment, but he had all sorts of views on all sorts of social issues. And he was a tremendous lawyer, and the cases he handled were always front page news. And so that made an extraordinary confluence of events to have him in Vermont for this case when it eventually gets to the Vermont Supreme Court.
We'll get back to him in a moment. Let's just go back here. You mentioned Calvin Coolidge, who was lived in Plymouth.
Right, 30 miles away.
And then, so you mentioned also how the police, their initial thought was to go and basically round up a suspect within the Windsor jail. How did John Winters get on their radar?
I think it was fairly random from what I can find from that. Winters, he'd served time for sexual assault for rape. He'd been released, he was 32 years old. He'd served 6 years of a 12-year sentence. He hadn't been in trouble since he had been released. He got out of, he initially went to prison in 1913, was released on Christmas Eve, 1919, and had a fairly steady life as far as you could figure. But again, the local police and the sheriff particularly, who was a piece of work in his own right, focused on Winters. In those days, you could bring somebody in, which they did. They hadn't arrested him. They put him in the death cell at Windsor Prison for 5 days. The sheriff, in a remark that I'm sure the prosecutors found very unhelpful, said he won't be able to withstand the cruel grilling that he'll receive from the Attorney General's investigator. So, they thought they could bring him in and get a confession.
Did he get access to representation?
No, at that point in time, of course, he didn't have access to representation. This is before the so-called Miranda warnings that didn't come until almost 40 years later. There was a debate over, actually the prosecutors say they offered him representation. He said, yes, but you didn't do that until after I'd signed something. So there really was a point in time, again, in the 20s, and that's another context I try to set here, is you have to remember that the criminal justice system was a different system. The defense lawyers wouldn't know what evidence the prosecutors had. The police could keep somebody sequestered or in prison and question them for a long period of time. And in fact, when the issue arose in the appeal, the issue of what statements could be allowed or not allowed, the Supreme Court, in saying that no, it was up to the trial judge, cited a case in which the court only 5 years before, so 1920 or so, had upheld a confession that was received when they had chained a defendant to the floor in a cell and waited till he confessed, and that was considered admissible under Vermont law in 1920. So much different context, and again, part of, again, in the 20s, a fixation on crime waves, Al Capone. As far as everybody was concerned, everybody was being murdered, so, because that's what people were reading about. So there was very much a law and order context, which, again, led to a reinstatement of capital punishment in a lot of states that abolished it. New methods of capital punishment. Vermont, who had some unfortunate experiences with hangings, decided to reinstate, to continue the death penalty, but was persuaded that the electric chair was a much more humane.
Much more humane, absolutely. Yeah. I can just hear people saying as they're listening to this, talking about this lack of due process, oh, how times have changed.
Yes, right. Well, I think it's when you don't have due process, you'll miss it. Trust me.
Yeah, I think many are wondering about that today. Let's advance here. So John Winters is convicted. He's sentenced to death. And it's at this point that Clarence Darrow comes on the scene. First of all, for those that have forgotten, talk a little bit about Clarence Darrow and some of these incredible cases he was previously involved in.
So, again, as I've said, Darrow is a figure that, depending on your age, you would recognize immediately. But, when I compared, I said, well, Darrow was as famous as Babe Ruth. People would have to say, well, I don't know who Babe Ruth is either. So,
okay.
So Darrow's fame came from his enormous capacity to persuade jurors, and his arguments in court, in jury trials. He was not an appellate lawyer. His fame was from jury trials, and he had built a record of extraordinary success as a defense lawyer. And interestingly enough, in the 3 years, so this is when he gets interested in when it comes to the Vermont case, he has, in the 3 previous years, been involved in the 3 most publicized cases in the history of the United States up to that point, probably. The first and foremost being Loeb and Leopold case where 2 wealthy young teenagers from wealthy families in Chicago engaged in a thrill-killing torture, a worldwide sensational crime, really, the way the press covered it. And there was no question that had the case gone to a jury, that Darrow would have lost that case and they would have been executed. But he was retained by the family, and his strategy was to plead guilty to first-degree murder, but to then argue that capital punishment, they shouldn't be executed. And no one thought that he would succeed in that. And there were literally riots in Chicago when he was making his arguments so that they should not be sentenced to death. But he prevailed in that. And again, it was an example of his extraordinary opposition to capital punishment, which had deep roots in his own background. One commentator said he had an insane desire to save people from the death penalty, and it really was his predominant reason for always being involved in cases in which capital punishment was an issue.
Well, let me just stop you there. Because I want to get to the other cases, some that are really famous. What was that all about? What do you think motivated him to be so opposed to the death penalty?
I think it was an experience of his father, who, as a young man, went to an execution. In those days, of course, Darrow would often return to this phrase, they hanged you high on a hill. And so his father was 14 or 15 years old, excited just like everybody else to go see somebody to be hanged. Got to the front of the line, and then was so appalled by what he saw that it was always a story that his father returned to again and again. And I think the telling of it certainly, I think, was part of his growing up. Darrow would return to that same phrase often, hanged high on a hill. And, again, it seems like ancient history, but, in Vermont, there were hangings in which 15 or 20,000 people would show up to watch somebody be hanged. And Darrow would say, and often said in his arguments against the death penalty, that what this is supposed to make everybody good to watch this hanging. And for example, in Loeb and Leopold, he said, if you hang these boys, this will be front page news all over the world, which it certainly would have been. And he said, is that going to make us better or worse? And so that's a very deeply held belief that drove his willingness to take the Vermont case.
Talk about the other two famous cases.
So that was Loeb and Leopold was 1925. 1926 was not a death penalty case, but one which at least some listeners will be familiar with, the so-called monkey case, the Scopes monkey case, in which Darrow, the issue of whether creationism should be taught in school and whether Darwinism should not be taught in school, rising out of a Tennessee law, and famously became a showdown between Darrow, who of course believed in Darwinism and the scientific method, versus the former presidential candidate and great orator William Jennings Bryan, who was a creationist. That was, again, a hugely publicized trial, one folks read about all over the world and broadcast as well. And Darrow's cross-examination of Bryan is one of the famous cross-examinations, which he absolutely destroyed on the stand, any shred of credibility that Bryan had. And that was the second in that string of three famous cases, and a third one less familiar to most listeners, I think, and one that I was less familiar with is a case involving Darrow defending a black doctor in Chicago who had moved into a white neighborhood, and then when a white mob attacked the house, he and his sons had defended themselves, fired into the crowd, and they were sentenced to charged with murder. Darrow defended the doctor, and the jury acquitted him, again on Darrow's representation, much to the shock of everyone who thought that it would be impossible to get a fair verdict in that time and in Chicago.
It's a fascinating story how Darrow gets involved in this Winters case.
Yeah.
How did that happen? So
this is I've led you from 1925 and up to 1927. On his 70th birthday in 1927, April of 1927, Darrow announced his retirement, and he said, I'm not going to do any more cases. I intend to lecture against capital punishment. I'm going to write, but I'm not. I'm done with doing any law beyond speaking about the subjects, but no more cases. and so he does retire. 1 month later, in May, he's at Dartmouth to give a lecture why he opposes capital punishment. His son had gone to Dartmouth, had graduated there from 1904, and Darrow, so it's sort of a natural place for Darrow to go to start his lecture tour on capital punishment. And when he finishes his lecture, and of course the place was packed with everybody trying to get in to see the famous Darrow, a woman comes up to him and hands him a letter. He looks at it, and it turns out that the letter is it's a letter his son had written to this woman, or the family of this woman, in 1904 when Darrow's son was a student there. And it promises that if any member of that family is ever in trouble, Paul Darrow, the son, promises that his father, Clarence Darrow, who was a famous lawyer even in 1904, will come to their aid. Darrow knows nothing about this. His son has never told him. And it turns out it arises out of a fatal accident that his son was in 1904. Three days from graduation, a horse got spooked. It killed a 5-year-old member of this family. And the woman, Mrs. Cooley, says to Darrow, "I need your help. My nephew is John Winters, and he's on death row in Vermont." So Darrow immediately writes to his son and says, I'm sorry this has bothered you all these years. Of course I'll help and I'll do what I can. I don't think there's much I can do, but I'll argue the case to the Vermont Supreme Court, and if we lose, I'll go to the governor. So that's the context of how it all arrives. And I have to say that that's really what sort of precipitated one of my interest in the case. I knew about the murder because I'd been in Windsor, and I began my practice of law in Windsor, and so people had always talked about, there was a picture in the lawyer's room of the Windsor County Courthouse of the trial, and so it was a notorious case that even 5 or 6 decades was still on. But I didn't know anything about Clarence Darrow's participation in the case, and then I'm reading, as a young assistant attorney general, I'm researching case, and the case of State versus Winters I'm reading that because there's an issue in it I need to cite on an evidentiary question, and I'm looking at it, and it says representing Winters, Clarence Darrow of Chicago, Illinois, and I went, wow, what in the world is Clarence Darrow doing in Vermont representing this guy? I mean, he's not, so that's what got me started.
And the son never told his father, Clarence Darrow, about this letter?
No.
Wow. I mean, that's just, you can't make that up.
Yeah. So sort of extraordinary sequence of events, and one that, again, brings Darrow to Vermont. And by the time he arrives in Vermont, the initial argument is in January of 1928. Again, it's just extraordinary news that he's arriving in Vermont. And when he arrives, it's all about, now people know the context of why he's coming. They know about the letter and all the rest. But it's interesting to read the newspaper accounts because reporters are asking, what do you think of Vermont? What did you have for breakfast? And,
that's big. That's big news.
Yeah. But I mean, Darrow, that was, everybody wanted to know, right? That's how great a celebrity he was. It had, so that's the context that begins what is sort of the second half of the book. The book is a short book. When I look back at the time I spent on it, I said, I think I averaged writing about two pages a year here, but it divides into really the two natural halves of the book. The first being the trial, which is extraordinary, and I had the good luck of finding the transcript for the trial, so I could build the drama of the trial, I hope, in a way that engages readers. And then when Darrow arrives, I talk about, from my own experience on the court, some of the dynamics of what the court had to face in terms of the issues. So I try to avoid getting too far deep in the law there, but it does. There'd never been a first degree, I have to say this with some reservation because I just couldn't get all the way back. I don't believe the Vermont Supreme Court had ever reversed a first degree murder case. And there certainly was no chance that if Clarence Darrow had not been involved in this case, it would have been not a close question. Darrow's involvement made it a close question.
It's like having Perry Mason show up in town.
Yeah.
What was the case, and what was the Vermont case that cited that? that you mentioned that you were when you were Assistant Attorney General?
Well, it was, there were a number of issues that were raised on appeal in the Winters case. There were actually 7 issues, and one of the 7 was an issue in the trial. They recreated in court the bloody bed of the victim, and the question was that fair demonstrative evidence or not? And the court said yes, it was. So whatever, I don't remember the case I was looking at, but I was looking for something that would support the use of demonstrative evidence in court. And
wow.
if they supported the bloody bed, I figured it would probably be helpful to whatever I was trying to do.
Wow. It reminds me a little of OJ. You mentioned that you were practicing down in Windsor County. I spent a lot of time in that White River Junction courthouse building. I don't remember the photo.
So this is
the painting. Right?
Yeah. So this would have been in Windsor Woodstock Courthouse.
Okay, got it.
So that was with the Windsor Superior Court at the time, and that's where the murder trials were. And of course So yes, that was a sort of a classic setting, right? And
incredible building.
And the trial was Winters was arrested in. Again, he wasn't arrested. He was seized in November of 1926. They filed charges against him in December of 26, and the trial began in January of 1927, and it lasted really about 30 days, about a month. Pretty cold weather, and but huge crowds. Even then, Darrow was not involved, but the case was a sensational case, and the special prosecutor was a lawyer named Raymond Traynor, who I was unfamiliar with, and I think everybody else would be, except some real old timers, who was probably in his early 40s then, and had a reputation as a great trial lawyer. And when you read the transcript, I certainly agreed with that. He was a tremendous lawyer, but he had one goal in mind, and that was to convict this guy, no matter what the evidence.
Wow.
So it was game on, and there's a chapter called Game On, because once Winters once they finally charge him, then they have to give him a lawyer, right? And so the court assigned him a lawyer. Actually, there were 2. One was very good and one was very bad. As soon as Winters does have a lawyer, his lawyer asked the question, on what possible evidence did you arrest him on a charge of murder? He asked for a hearing on that, and he says, what's the evidence? And Traynor knows that's a good question. He can't answer it. So there are a lot of reasons and a lot of ways he handles the case until he can get into a position where he can answer it.
And we're going to leave that for people to read. How did you find the transcript?
Transcript was in the Vermont State Archives, 3 volumes.
God, that's amazing.
1,000 pages. Windsor, like other courts that were worried about their archives and their records, shipped them to the Vermont State Archive at the behest and request of the Vermont State Archives. Was worried about Vermont losing records, which they did, of course, after the 1927 flood in a lot of places. In any event, it was just luck.
You must have had a field day researching this.
Well, there were good days and bad days, like anything else. But yeah, no, there's, again, for me, I think I talk a little bit in my introduction in the book, that, I thought I brought to the book some experience, both as Attorney General and as Chief Justice, that gave me an insight and a perception and a way to write it that, would I think provide a little bit more context than maybe other authors could have.
That's an understatement. The discovery of Clarence Darrow, were you going to write about the murder anyway, or was it when you found Darrow that...
No, it was Darrow. I mean, that's an excellent question, because I have to remember myself, I have to recall to myself that I got into it because of Darrow. And again, to try to give it to some folks what it meant for Darrow to be in Vermont, it's the nearest I could come up with, but of course you had to know who Babe Ruth was. I said in the 1920s, it would have been the equivalent of Babe Ruth saying, I'm going to come to Vermont and pinch hit for the Rutland, semi-professional Rutland baseball team. I mean, that would have been, extraordinary story, right? I mean, and this was just the equivalent of that. But I think once I got into the case and the 1920s and Vermont and the culture. It became a different book than what I thought it would be, which I thought would be primarily about, well, I didn't know, but it was. I started with Darrow's interest, but it turns out to be really a book about Vermont, and I think that's why the Vermont Historical Society decided it was a good fit.
Which I should have mentioned. I mean, you've been working pretty closely with the folks there. Really a great group of people to work with. What did you learn? I mean, you grew up in Rutland.
Right.
What did you learn about Vermont doing this book?
Yeah, it's interesting. The readers will decide for themselves whether or not John Winters was the murderer, but he grew up in Rutland. Not to make this all sound so sort of predestined or eerie, but the further I got into the book, I mean, I started my legal practice in Windsor. I was brought up in Rutland. It turns out the Attorney General and the Chief Justice were significant figures in this book, and I thought I had so I guess in answer to your question, I think I learned. It just gave me a better feel for, the culture of Vermont through that time period, and not that far removed from. One thing you learn as you get older is that the time ranges sort of collapse. So I grew up in Vermont in the 1950s. Well, that wasn't that far removed from when John Winters grew up in Vermont. I know where he grew up. Basically, I know my growing up wasn't the same as John Winters, but it wasn't all that different in terms of I knew the Rutland that he grew up in hadn't changed that much. So that part of that was just recognizing that the locality of it all. You had both some larger truths you could draw from all this in terms of criminal justice and environment and all the rest, but also it reminded me that we all come from pretty similar roots here, and we're all pretty close together, and so that was part of the journey, I think, in terms of my own writing of it.
How much have you? I mean, your whole career has been. I'm sure you've written. I can't even think of the hundreds or even thousands of legal briefs. What did you enjoy about writing this book?
Well, I didn't have to cite cases, so it wasn't legal research. Though I have to say there was some of that. But I think the challenge and the fun of it and the change is you have to decide. You have to create narrative tension. No book is good unless people will continue to turn the page, even if when you're writing a legal opinion, it's not the most important result is not to get lawyers to turn the pages of an opinion of the Supreme Court. They've got to read the opinion, right? But
don't they just go to the last page and find out?
Yeah, no, not. They do go there first, but then they have to figure out how. But so here the question was. So that was certainly part of the challenge, and I enjoyed trying to do that. And then when I got to the piece of the appeal before the Supreme Court, that provided an interesting challenge. That was sort of less fun to write than the first half. But my challenge there was, okay, you've got to talk about these legal issues and some of the issues on appeal and how it gets to the court and what the appellate process is and what a lawyer does there and all that, and try to make that a narrative that readers wouldn't find
accessible.
Accessible is the best word. And whether I've done that or not, but that was a challenge. That was a challenge. So but in terms of getting to the end of it, I said brevity is best, and I think if you can maintain the tension, even readers who can't stand reading at all about lawyers will be intrigued enough to get to find the ending, which has its own suspense, I think.
Would you learn a lot about Clarence Darrow? Was Clarence Darrow somebody that in the 50s and when you were in law school, was this somebody that was a larger-than-life figure to you then? Would you learn about him?
Yeah, I mean, Darrow was, I was saying Darrow was not that I was paid much attention to Darrow, but Darrow was, at least for lawyers, I was trying to think of an analogy, but people would say, well, you'll need an Einstein to figure this out, or what are you, an Einstein? Well, Darrow was sort of the same way in the legal, or I think in the cop shows they would go, the only way you're going to get this guy off is to have Clarence Darrow. That's how well known he was. I think Darrow. There's movies about Darrow. There's still movies about Darrow. He was a complicated figure. I think what most fascinated me about him was he didn't believe in justice. He thought justice was a concept that made no sense at all. He believed in mercy, and that's a concept that I had a difficult. It's difficult to grasp. I think readers will find it difficult to grasp. I don't talk about that except in the context of this case, in a way that I hope will prompt some readers to think about that. And for me, I thought, that's, to me, it's extraordinary that he held on to that his whole life. I didn't have any problem in understanding his belief that the law and hypocrisy go hand in hand. I mean, he lived through the lots of cases. I mean, in the Prohibition period of time, and again, one has to remember that this is in the 1920s. Right. This Prohibition, Windsor was known as an open town. One of the articles that I cite is the minister of Congregational Church haranguing after this murder, in which alcohol was involved. The Rotarians saying, this is Windsor's an open town, and I'm saying that would certainly not have been a surprise to any of the Rotarians, I don't think, or to anybody else. Calvin Coolidge, everybody was trying to stay away from prohibition as an issue by 1926, 27. I mean, it was a failed experiment, but no one had the courage to, they're all saying what the law has to be enforced. Of course, everybody's looking the other way. I think that's a significant piece of that. And Darrow, there's a story I tell about Darrow when he's waiting for a verdict in Detroit. He asked the court clerk, he says, go to the judge's scotch supply and let's break out some booze while we wait. And of course, everybody, it's just, so Darrow, that was no surprise to Darrow. And I mean, he had much more vivid examples of that in his own experience of the hypocrisy in the law. So, I mean, I think he had an extraordinary sense of what bothered people on a jury or on a judge, I think. And he had that sense, I think a phrase I use, he knew it before you knew it. He knew what bothered you before you knew it. And I think he knew that about the Vermont Supreme Court, too.
Wow, what a gift. What's the tension for you between justice and mercy?
Well, the tension between, I can only speak to how Darrow formed it.
No, well, you said you had trouble with it too.
Well, the tension was, and I think you'll see that the tension of being, should you be merciful if it's an unjust result? When you go, I mean, that's always the tension. You go, I believe in mercy, but not here, not in this case, not in this case. That's unjust. I mean, and I think that's a tension that's there. People. It's to provide mercy even when you think that would work an injustice. That's a tension, and I think that's a tension here. And for Darrow, he had resolved that, saying, "Well, I don't care how unfair the result might be in terms of the victims or the crime or all the rest." Who's ever charged for the crime deserves mercy, and that's all I'm concerned about. And I'll leave aside for the rest of you to figure out what the justice of it all is.
Where was the tension for you in that?
I don't think I ever thought of it in that sense, right? So, because I always thought of it in terms of trying to find a just result, one consistent with the law, one that was fair and equitable, and all the kinds of standard sort of conventional ways one would look at that kind of an issue, I think. So I never thought of it in the terms that he thought of it, which was just, I think, would strike most people as unorthodox, I guess I would say.
Okay. So, do you think that this is going to resonate with the average non-legal type person out there?
Yeah, I think it might, because if it's readable enough, I think it's readable. It's it's brief. And I think it, as you said, there is a certain interest in murder cases, and this is a murder case. And it's probably Vermont's, certainly I would say, and this is where I'll leave it at this, where the severed head comes in. Certainly in terms of the trial itself, I don't have any hesitation in calling that the most sensational exhibit in the history of Vermont trials.
Did you ultimately feel that justice was served and that mercy was granted?
I'm going to leave. I have a feeling. I have an opinion on guilt and innocence. I have an opinion on motive. I have an opinion on justice and mercy. But my opinion is not any more valuable than a reader's opinion. So I'll let each reader make up his or her mind.
And I guess I can't just turn to the last page to see if you concur or dissent.
No, I think I would urge you to start at the beginning.
Okay, and read every page carefully all the way through. That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, brought to you by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks to Jeff Amestoy, and thanks for listening.